Welcome to class number 2 for this UX design and Adobe XD workshop. First of all, thanks for the nice comments some of you shared over the Google form I shared at the end of the last session. I appreciate some of you, I think, had a good time. I'm definitely passionate about this, so hopefully we're all learning within this process. And yeah, I'm super excited about this class in particular. We're going to do a deep dive into user-centered design. As a heads up, this is still going to be a mostly theoretical class, so bear with me on that. But as for the next couple of sessions, we're gonna start using Adobe XD to work on some UX deliverables, and you guys are going to get hands-on on this. Okay, so first thing, there were a couple of questions in that form I wanted to address first. So thank you for your questions. They were good. Number one, I received this. I would like to know which of the roles you described in UX and user experience design is more important for a backend developer in order to increase performance. So to be honest, you can do pretty much everything. And as we were saying, roles are going to be working on different ends at all times, but there's still a lot of collaboration going on. But I think backend development is all about establishing the logic and just like organizing the information that we're getting from clients and users, right? So I would personally say that user research and information architecture more than roles are like concepts that would align more with those tasks. So for example, if you're like building an inventory application, like with products, with machines, with tools, and you're trying to organize those, in order for you and the team to define how things should be organized or grouped, let's say, it would be a good idea for you guys to learn how do people search and find those products. So in order to define your database, your tables, the relationship between elements, you can do that in order to learn how people, you can group and define the categories and things like that after you understand how people search and find products. So you can do this by working these two concepts of user research and information architecture together. It would be nice if in the future workshops, you can go over some real cases, some like exemplifying methods and techniques. Definitely. This session will cover a couple of examples, including methodologies and inherent techniques, so you guys have a better idea of the process. So that's definitely common. And these are the questions I had, so thank you for that. Going through the agenda real quick, this session's topics are going to be origins and definition of user-centered design, the principles of the process, famous frameworks that are used around the world, methodologies, and examples. Let's start with the origins and definition of user-centered design. As we discussed last time, in a nutshell, we're trying to move away from the model where you, the developers and the leadership in a specific company, define the requirements, right? User-centered design is about moving away from that into a process that includes real end users through the design process. This doesn't mean like asking users how they want things and apply them as they are. It's just about getting their input and trying to solve problems from their perspective. This is a brief process that we're going to dive into in a little later, but these 4 phases are the main ones across different frameworks. Just doing research, having an ideation process where you define the requirements in a better way, design the solution, and evaluate that solution against the original requirements that were raised. In terms of the origins, the term was introduced by Donald Norman, who's a very famous person in the industry regarding design and ergonomics, and the whole term was invented by him in the 80s when the computers were starting to explore graphic user interfaces, and the early internet democratized the use of computers, and things were of that nature were we had a broad set of people that weren't necessarily engineers that were using computers. So user-centered design became sort of like a need in order to make something very simple and broadly usable. But the term sort of like was approximated as a concept like way before that. So by I was saying last session, by mid-century, by mid 20th century, machines and tools in war became more complex, so that they needed design interventions to be able to be used. And along those lines, I think it was in the 50s where Henry Dreyfuss telephone, for example, was a landmark that represented this whole thing. Just imagine how this element to be used by hundreds of millions of people should be designed. Like, how do you place numbers? How do you make the speaker be comfortable for longer conversations? How can this be connected to an electrical output and things like that, right? There was also the idea of participative design in the 60s, where European societies like require a deeper involvement of communities in the creation of spaces. This is why you tend to see how like European communities in general are a little more organized. They have a better structure. They have stronger, more defined policies for constructing buildings, for organizing spaces, for giving people like the sense of how things are distributed, and so forth. I think that became famous in the 60s in particular. And ethnography as a concept, as a research concept, was that means like studying cultures in their own context, not by looking at books or not by discussing among your peers in your own culture. It means getting out there and being involved in the actual context to understand by observation, right? So ethnography techniques like observation and contextual interviews were used by companies like Xerox in the 70s to develop products and services. And again, these are all notions that we had before the 80s about user-centered design already. So when we find a definition, again, it's just about, it's a design philosophy, not even a process. It's a design philosophy that has for a goal the creation of spaces, products, and services that revolve around users by addressing their specific needs with a high degree of satisfaction and with minimal effort. You might have heard of the term human-centered design, which is a more broad definition that relates to behavior and psychology and things like that. It's a little more complex. But that is outside the realm of human-computer interaction. So users, as a term, related to our interaction with software and technology, is more related to human-computer interaction. In terms of principles, according to the ISO norm, which is sort of like a very broad concept. Guys, give me 5 seconds. I have a little background noise. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, going back to the principles. These 6 things are a very interesting perspective on how user-centered design should serve us, should serve users and people, right? First of all, the design should be based on explicit understanding of users, their activities, and their environments. You know, if we're designing something, for example, for doctors, you know, like let's say a tablet application for them to collect patient information, how can we understand the urgency, the characteristics, the context that they work in if we don't talk to them, if we don't dig into how their context and their activities work? For example, there might be a time where you need to do that very urgently. And if your interface and if your experience is not allowing them to have a swift, effective way to perform their tasks, they're not going to be able to complete their goals. And by that end, the product is useless, right? In terms of involving users, they have to be involved for the entire design process. They need to have a voice. They're not designers, but they need to have a voice. The design is directed and adjusted by permanent evaluation with real users. As we were looking at the process just a moment ago, the process doesn't end with a prototype or with an implementation. That's it. Like the real impact of the experience is measured when real users use our products, right? So it's very important that the cycle ends with an evaluation of the solution that you're proposing. And that's why we thought we go to number 4, which is talking about user-centered design and an iterative process, because whenever you're evaluating, you're going to find things that you have to improve on. So the cycle starts all over again. You start to find new problems. You need to frame them, understand them, raise new requirements, and create a new version, an improved version of that product, right? And number 5 talks about how the design should cover the complete experience of users. This is an example I gave also in the previous session. How good can a website be, like, if it's beautifully designed, but it takes forever to load, right? How good is navigating through an excellent user interface if, I don't know, it doesn't matter if I have a bad internet or not, but if I have a hard time using that website, it doesn't matter how pretty it is. It's just I'm not going to have a good experience. So we need to cover a lot of corners, and this is why user experience design and user-centered design is not only about visuals, about industrial design and the shape of things. It takes a lot more. And ultimately, again, this relates to that. The design team includes many profiles and perspectives. It's not only about visual capabilities and things like that, as we were discussing. There are a lot of complexity within the roles and the things that we need to perform user-centered design. Let's talk about some famous frameworks that you might have heard around. But before that, let's talk about the fundamentals of every framework. No matter what you hear, like design thinking, IDEO, Agile, Lean, they all rely on the concept of research and design. Research is about understanding who will use our products, their needs, their motivations, limitations, expectations. And design is actually the process of taking decisions to shape or mold a product upon those findings. This is the hard part. Doing research for ourselves or giving advice to most companies in terms of doing research is something that I particularly have find difficult with industries like the oil and gas, for example. They're so complex, and they have practices that are so deeply established that telling a client to take a couple of months to go out there and research with their users, it's not something easy to digest, but it is. I think it's critical to the success of the product. Again, you can do it without it, of course, but you're increasing the chances of not fulfilling your user needs. And we have 2 types of research in general. Before design, we need to discover the needs and to gather information for analysis. And after design, as we were talking with evaluation, we need to evaluate if the design choices are meeting the needs of our users. So one of the frameworks that it's the most commonly used out there is the ISO norm, which is pretty similar to the scheme that we've been looking at, right? Is this whole idea about planning, understanding the context of use, specifying user requirements, producing design solutions, evaluating the designs against requirements, and having the decision having the moment where you think about if that design solution is meeting the requirements, or if it needs to go back to a design stage or to a requirement stage or a research stage. So this is why the process becomes iterative. Agile UX is another famous framework. By the mid-90s, new methodologies appeared as an answer to the limitations of traditional waterfall process. That meant involving you had to finish one thing after you start another. And that usually was very restricted in terms of how you plan, how you do your product. It was very difficult to change things along the way or make different decisions upon new findings. You had to wait until a new iteration of the product. And by 2001, the early 2000s, people like engineers were starting to think that that's not very useful. People change all the time. And if we have to create a massive platform within 6 months, maybe the requirements that we raised originally are not going to be the same ones we find on month 5 and month 6. Maybe we need additional things. Maybe we need to change things along the way. So this is when, in 2001, the Agile Manifesto was created, which aligned better with user-centered design principles, and it basically gave engineers and the whole like technology and software development industry the idea of the following principles. Client satisfaction is a priority. We don't need to focus on features. We need to make products be delivered early and within a valuable output. We need to have cross-team collaborations. In the early 90s, especially through the 90s, software had a boom, right? Again, people were like, the technology was democratized. Everyone started to have their own personal computer at home. They had laptops. We had new devices going on. And that meant that the engineers were not on, engineers were the ones that at the beginning were trying to make all the decisions, right? They were trying to make users fit with the product. Like they were trying to make people understand and be comfortable with the products and not the other way around. So the idea about the agile methodologies is that we work with incremental deliveries as well to make sure changes along the way are possible, depending on how we perform research. And that gives us a way to adjust requirements as the product is developed, which is a very important thing nowadays, because there are a lot of startups, there are a lot of companies that are exploring and thinking out things, and they're not going to come with a 200-page requirement document detailing exactly what they want, right? And this is what we use at WebCreek. We actually have a sort of like a hybrid methodology where we use Scrum, which is the sort of like the flagship of Agile. And this is sort of like the overall process that we use with sprints, right? We have a backlog grooming where we do this instance of doing research and creating the stories that will ultimately be designed, prototype, tested, developed, and so forth, right? So it's like smaller cycles of work that can give you incremental results and allow you to change things as you go. Well, ideally, you shouldn't change a whole lot, but it gives you some flexibility to make your product take design changes within the process. Lean UX takes some things from Agile, but it's a little bit different in the sense that it's all about validating hypotheses as fast as possible. Instead of looking at a set of functionalities that have to be built, we think of hypotheses about users that have to be tested. And this is where we talk about minimum viable products in Lean. Because the goal about Lean methodologies is not to create the perfect ultimate product and take a lot of time to do it. It's actually about getting the most valuable product in the least amount of time in order to test it so you can build upon it, right? And the idea is, again, to develop a product with basic functionalities in order to test the value and then add functionalities and complexity. It's all based on user feedback, and this is why we try to finish early, because we want to see how it's used, what is missing, what is good, what can we keep, what has to be improved. And again, it's based on iterations. It tries to have different releases and different versions of the product. And this is where we relate to agile development, because it is flexible, it has a better interpretation of documentation and things like that. So this is sort of like the comparison between both, if you were wondering and if things weren't clear. Like within Lean, we talk about minimum viable products, and with Agile, we talk about sprints. We talk about sort of like a bigger product divided in chunks, right? But an MVP could be its own product, but a very basic idea to be tested, right? And we have like a couple of techniques and roles as the Scrum process and the Scrum Master for Agile UX. But on the side of Lean, we have design analysts and designers talking to customers, solving specific problems and things like that, right? But they're both user-centered design approaches. There's this firm called IDEO. Maybe you guys have heard it. They are very famous for pushing this human-centered design concept. As I was saying, it's a little more broad than user-centered design, but it has the same spirit. And this design firm, was founded by David Kelly, who is the pioneer behind design thinking. And human-centered design has a more complex dynamic, because it covers a lot more aspects. This is why this design firm actually doesn't develop a lot of products. They develop social impact solutions. They have helped a lot of initiatives around the world to, I don't know, like provide clean water to people in Africa, or giving access to technology to third world countries and things like that. They revolve around that sort of action, and I'm sure like their model can apply to everything, but that's how they become famous. And their process is in the same vein of doing research and design and evaluation, but they cover three angles in specific: what's desirable for people, what's factable from the technology standpoint, and what's viable from the business standpoint. So it's very complete and it's very interesting and very worth looking at. And there are a lot more, but the last one I want to cover today is Google's design sprint. I think this is, if you guys have a business idea, I would suggest you use this model to test your idea. And it's very intense, but it's awesome. Google created a methodology based on users, where within a week you can build a minimum viable product and do specific tasks that are very intense within 5 days. In the first day you do research, you understand who are the users, what are their needs. In the second one, you diverge, where you start to envision and define the solution, you ideate the solution. In day number 3, you decide. You choose the best idea of the group. You can work. This process is usually done by a group of 4 or 5 people that involves developer, a tester, maybe a designer, maybe a business folk, and they can all present with ideas, but the idea is that by day number 3, you can filter the best one and you can storyboard it. By day number 4, you can build something very quick and dirty to show users in order to evaluate. And by day 5, you can show the prototypes out, show them the prototype outside the organization, and learn about if that works or not. So it's more used to solve questions from the innovation standpoint, by like creating new things, instead of actually being a process that's used for a broader, like more complex product like the ones that we used to do at WebCreek. But it helps solve things quickly and test them quickly in particular. And talking about methodologies, and the question I had last week is, let me go back to this vision right here, which I think it's a little more understandable, with the 4 phases that we have, which are research, ideation, design, and evaluation. There are questions and methods and techniques that pertain to each one. This, I think, this is a good way to think about it. Within these 4 phases that are iterative, you have questions that you want to answer. When you're doing research, you want to know who are your users, what are their goals, what are their needs, right? And within the methods and techniques, you can do contextual research, for example. You can go out there and basically observe people and how they use mobile phones, how they navigate a website, how, I don't know, if you want to do like more interesting products or services, you can go to a supermarket and learn how people buy at supermarkets and things like that. You can use techniques like co-participation, which involve having individual interviews, focus groups, and doing remote research, where you actually talk, you ask questions, you have conversations with users. You can also perform benchmarks and see what are the competitors doing, what is the value proposition that you're adding within the ecosystem of proposals that users already have. And you can perform many other techniques like cart sorting, user diaries. We're going to take a look at some of these in a bit with the examples, and hopefully that makes more sense. But those are kind of like methods and techniques you perform in research, which is, in my opinion, the most important phase of all. When you're analyzing the product, then you ask, how will the users use my product? Like, how will they find the information they need? How we can align the technology and the constraints I have within budget and technology and so forth, and shape the product. We can create user personas and scenarios where we define, okay, let's say we're creating I use the same example over and over again, but it's very relevant. Let's say you create something for the construction industry. Construction engineers have huge hands, have huge fingers. So you need to consider that across all your design process in order to have things be readable, accessible, efficient, and things like that. So personas and scenarios and empathy maps allow you to be informed about that all the time. You can also perform information architecture in order to start to group and organize information for your either website or your web application in terms of making sitemaps. We're going to do one of these in 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 the upcoming sessions. You can do mind maps. You can do card sorting, which is an exercise where you basically invite users to group terms according to their own understanding. This is very useful specifically for products like e-commerce or that have a lot of information within that has to be organized. Let's say Amazon, for example, I bet they're constantly doing exercises like card sorting to understand how people tend to group things, because the next step of that is finding things. If I go to Amazon and I want to find, I don't know, like let's say a headset, how do I search for that? Do I look for a brand? Do I look for color? Do I look for price? We need to think about that when we're doing analysis. And in terms of interaction, you can start to play user flows about the specific actions or the like most important ones that your user might do. And that can relate to more complex diagrams like customer journey, where you can start, hey, I'm downloading the application. How do I find the application? Do I have to log in? Is it monetized? How can I pay? Is it safe to pay? There are a lot of things that you can think about those journeys and where you can make design and business decisions, which are very interesting. And whenever you're done analyzing and like gathering your findings, you finally design. You take design decisions with either idea generation methods like the thinking hats, brainstorming, crazy eight exercises, and finally creating prototypes that you can test, that you can build and say, okay, this is my hypothesis. So I'm going to build a prototype to show it around and see if people relate to that, if they react positively, or if they react negatively, what am I doing wrong? And you can have different levels of prototyping with low, medium, and high fidelity. We're going to do a couple of these as well on the sessions in the next couple of weeks. So look forward to that. And as part of the evaluations, we want to answer, what are the elements that make my experience true? Are requirements being met? I mean, I have a solution, but what's the perception of the user at this point? You can have two things. You can have expert inspection with heuristic evaluation, cognitive walkthroughs that are basically a set of processes that are already established, where you work with design experts to measure and to define if things are being met or problems are being found in the experience. And you can also do user evaluation, like user testing, A/B testing, web analytics, that actually, again, measure if, from the user perspective, if things are being met or the requirements are aligned, right? In terms of research, which again, to me is the most important phase of all, you can have two types of research. Now, and they divide themselves in quantitative and qualitative research. And they answer to very specific goals. So quantitative research answers the question of what or how many, right? But qualitative research is all about why. And the purpose about each of those are very different. And in terms of the roles, the settings, and the analysis, they change depending on the technique that you use. But I think for the most part, qualitative research is ideal for user-centered design because it focuses on people. When you're doing quantitative research, which is completely valid and it's thought out for very specific scenarios, no matter which project, they don't analyze the users. They analyze the end behavior, right? But they analyze sort of like the conclusion of that behavior. So for example, when you're doing surveys, you're not having an opinion. You're not looking at someone and like interpreting an emotion. You're looking at a yes or no. You're looking at a value, a measure, that it's very useful, but it might not be enough to give value to your product because you're only looking at values, at information that can be measured and can be scaled, but it's not really behind a person. I mean, it is behind a person, but it doesn't have the context of actually understanding emotions or needs, or again, answering why things are happening, or why are problems being interpreted that way. Again, these are both very useful, and they are usually, or at least they should be used in close collaboration. I mean, when you're designing a website, You can use web analytics to find out about potential problems a specific page is having, or if your conversions are getting low, or if you have low visitors, and that can be the beginning of a research process where you actually go out and see what are the problems. We're going to have an example, an interesting example in a minute about how these two can be related. And again, you can use both types of research, but in my opinion, and I think that is the expert opinion as well, is that user-centered design is more aligned, and its qualitative research is aligned, and it's ideal for user-centered design, where we have examples like one-on-one interviews, like focus groups, or contextual observation, where you as a designer are observing things that are not measured, things that are spontaneous, things that are coming from the unconscious side of the brain of users, and that in my also has more richness to how users behave, which is the ultimate goal of any type of research and user experience. And let's talk about examples, as you guys were asking, and how these processes take shape in real life scenarios. Okay, so I'm going to read through this, but I'm going to explain them as well. So what was the challenge of this company? While designing a video streaming platform for kids, our designers realized that they didn't know exactly how children would use the product, or if the patterns of behavior in the app would differ by age. Okay, so imagine you or your kid or your nephew, or whenever you can put yourself in the perspective of a kid. How can they use Netflix, for example? How can they use Amazon Prime or YouTube to find content? So the research scheme was that the team set out to understand how children watch these content, right? And they were like interested in uncovering how kids search and find things. How do they use this product from the searchability aspect? And to get these issues, they conducted usability tests with children of ages 3 and 14. And for example, usability testing, as we were seeing on the techniques for the evaluation side, means that you give users tasks to perform, and you, by observing, you measure how successful they are. You know, you take a kid of, let's say, 10 years old, and you say, okay, use this remote control and point to the TV and try to find your favorite cartoon. Okay, that is part of a user test that can be conducted within usability testing. So whenever you see the kid, like, I don't know, struggling to write words on the search control, or even struggling to use the remotes at all, you can find a lot of problems within that can be solved. And in the case of this particular product, obviously companies cannot solve how remotes work, right? But for example, Netflix, let's say if this is the case in Netflix, from their perspective, they can use user interface to facilitate that goal, which is to find a particular program or a cartoon for kids, right? So the outcome of this is that one of the most important findings they uncovered was that children across all ages, and I think this is an important annotation here, is that as different from adults, they search by character rather than the title. And they observed this when they were running the usability tests. So the finding completely changed the way how this was designed, and they focused on characters rather than the video title. You know, let's say you're talking, I don't know, a lot of kids shows nowadays, but let's say you're trying to find SpongeBob. You know, like, this is what actually I saw this yesterday. In Netflix does this for the kids role. They focus their imagery, their titles, and their search in characters. If you want to see SpongeBob, you don't necessarily find the logo of the series with a nice picture and you can select it. It has a prominence, and it raises your attention in relation to the character. And you can navigate products as a kid if you want, if you have that perspective. You're going to be able to find things easier if you're showing things with characters. So I think that was the outcome of this user-centered design example. Another example was maybe for an e-commerce website. So an e-commerce website for women's dresses was experiencing low conversions, right? And again, with the analytics, coming back to the techniques, it showed that you had a lot of visitors. You have a lot of visitors, but they had a high bounce rate. I mean, they landed on the website. There are a lot of people interested in going to your website, but the sessions are like very short and people just bounce. And the first thing you think is that maybe they're finding the prices expensive, but a previous benchmark, another technique you can use for research, tells you that the prices are competitive. So what is going on? The research entailed that the design and business team wanted to observe and understand how visitors use the website in order to find clues and what is happening with the conversions. So they perform user testing again with specific tasks to find a certain dress, for example, and a card sorting session to find if the current information architecture matches their search behavior. So what they found was that the categories and the labels of the products were terribly confusing for users. I mean, users like the product, they like the prices, but users had the intention to go in and purchase. And this was like interviews were done as well, and people said that they couldn't. I mean, they liked the clothing, they loved prices, but they couldn't find what they were looking for. The specific dress they saw in the campaign, they couldn't find that, and that was the problem. The West, because they got disappointed, they got frustrated, and they went out. They didn't purchase. So the design team used the findings of the card sorting exercises in order to create a taxonomy of categories and labels so people things find easier. You know, if we have 30 people in a card sorting exercise, and if they all group things more by color than by the actual name of the dress, they're gonna have an easier way to find things. But again, you can only learn about this if you research, if you look at if you go out there and look at the behavior of the users with your product. There's no other way. And I want to expand on a user-centered design process I did. This is for a master's program I followed last year, and I put my entire knowledge to do this process. Obviously, I didn't end up with a completely developed product, but I designed the product and I follow through the all the phases. So hopefully this makes sense to you. I'm going to go really quickly through it, and maybe afterwards we can address some questions. So my motivation was from two sides, right? From the professional end, I'm very interested in VR and extended reality experiences. And from the personal side, I was very interested in sort of like the exercises that my father-in-law does for his stroke recovery. He had a very serious accident a couple of years ago, and I was a witness of his recovery process, and it's very hard. So that made me get interested in a particular exercise he tried once, which was a VR rehab. And I started off from learning about things that are already out there, you know, like VR therapy, new solutions for VR interaction, things that are related to immersive experiences for doctors, for psychologists, for therapists, for nurses, and how these are being represented throughout. So I found incredibly interesting things, you know, like, for example, Brave Mind was done by this guy whose last name is Rizzo. I don't remember his first name ever, but he built this system where he helps ex-militaries, like in terms of diagnosing and treating PTSD with very realistic and emotional, immersive experiences that trigger their conflicts, you know, and their fears. So in order to make an additional program, a psychology program that can help them, you know, so it's very interesting. And specifically specifically for motor rehab, there are a couple of solutions I found out there that were related to seniors or to catastrophic diseases like Parkinson's, you know, that are having a lot of progress nowadays, and they have very, very interesting output. It's not super famous, like hospitals and physicians don't have this as first options, but they're very interesting, and we're going to learn about that in just a second. I performed the benchmark research where I dig down, where I looked at competitors and their products and sort of measured certain things according to to certain factors, their branding, their experience, their marketing, their usability degree, and things like that. I also performed semi-structured interviews with patients that have had motor rehab in the past. I talked to therapists, and I talked to design experts in VR. And all of those findings led me to define who my users were, and we had, like, for example, 3 types of personas that range from very small lesions of an athlete, of a young athlete, to a person like my father-in-law that had a permanent lesion that just like became impatient after years and years of painful rehab. They don't have any patience and they don't have any motivation. And there's also different roles and users that might be impacted about this, the therapist and the actual family that is helping people getting recovered. I only knew about this, especially, for example, the family involvement in this, but with the interviews. Most of the interviewees said that they either had a girlfriend, a friend, a brother, a mother, a father, deeply involved in reminding them of their rehab sessions, or of taking their medications, or supporting them in the sessions, actually. So that became a very important role. And talking about the scenarios, this defined like the actual design of the product. I wasn't only designing the UX side of things, I was designing the actual product. So the idea is that people have 2 factors when they're doing when they're doing physical rehabilitation, right? They have challenges such as the overall predisposition to pain, economical investment, the waste of time. Like, people don't want to have things interrupted, and they don't want to mobilize to a facility and do very painful sessions of rehab. And there are also people that are not, patients are not the only ones that go through this process. Therapists and family and friends are also part of this. So all these factors come into play when you're physically and emotionally trying to get rehabilitated, and the factor that drives the most is motivation. So this is why I proceeded with an idea of that related to music, because as we saw in the personas, we have young and relatively old people that might be interested in different things. But I think music was sort of like the common thread between all of them, and they can relate to that. Obviously, we want to have them move because that's the primary resource of rehab. And interaction is just to look at something that's familiar and something that's fun, so that you can forget about the pain and the uncomfortable aspects of doing rehab. And specifically, this product was thought out to be remote at-home rehabilitation with VR headsets. So that addresses the problem of mobilizing, giving just a smaller investment to the program, and just giving you a better way to face your pain and anxiety while you're doing the rehab. So we're going to do a couple of these again, but I thought of a side map and the flows that the user will experience when using this product. I worked on low and mid fidelity prototypes, and actually I used the mid fidelity prototype to be tested with design experts. And I chose a list of tasks and things they have to do. And the experts, when they saw my prototype and they put themselves in the shoes of the user, they said, this login screen I don't understand it. I don't think people are going to understand it either. I think this is confusing. I think this can be improved, and so forth. So that helped me refine the prototype, and I established the visual idea, and I created the final solution. And these are just the screenshots. Obviously, they're mocks of how this should be. For example, and as you can see, everything is very simple. Your users that are not super tech savvy can have very basic controls. They have suggestions, and they're accompanied all the time. You have a very quick and easy menu that you can go for. And when you're doing your session, your training session, that's actually directed by a therapist, you can choose, for example, the type of journey that you wanna work with, that you want to do your workout with, and you can see that person facing you, and you just have to follow their movements, and as accurate as you get, and you can actually configure how hard, how long, how difficult it is. You have indicators, how efficient you are. You're running the time of your session. You have a program to follow through, let's say 30 days of therapy to help you with your back pain. I don't know. And that is how the character will behave. If the emphasis is in your legs, they're going to do things related more to your legs. If you have problems with your back, they're going to give you movement to they're going to invite you to move according to the lesion that you have. Okay. So the conclusions about this were that therapy is uncomfortable and game is fun. And whenever you have a VR headset at home, especially within these times like the pandemic, you don't really have to mobilize to do therapy anymore. You can do this at home, and there are tools nowadays that allow to therapists, family, and people to be involved in the same process. And obviously, a remote solution means that you don't have to waste a lot of time by, I don't know, going out there, finding a cab, mobilizing, being on traffic. And that allows both therapists and patients to have more time to do what they want. The economic investment of getting a VR headset and signing up for one of these programs can be, on the long run, can be even more feasible than like on point one-by-one sessions. And therapists get to conserve protocols. They actually, you don't see that here, but I made an interface for therapists to assign programs and to amplify the access to information. And the end families and can also be invited to the platform and have a role in following up their friends or their family in their rehab process. Did they committed to the session? How efficient they were? Were they being lazy, or were they not doing the movements correctly? All those things can be followed, and family and friends can follow up on that too. Okay, so that's the end for today. So I think we have some time. Yeah, we have some 10 minutes if you guys have questions. I'm sure this was a lot, but hopefully it's the beginning of you guys digging deeper and getting familiar with more terms, with the process. Again, this what you saw here, especially from this example, is not something we do a lot, but ideally this is a process that if you got my point, it's ideal in terms of identifying things that are relevant for your product. Because what's the ultimate goal to that? Making stuff valuable. This is where you can actually have success as a product or service, because you're addressing real problems, right? And it all starts with doing research with real users. So that's it for me. So hope you guys enjoyed this, and I don't know. So does anybody have any questions?